I'd like to talk about something that's been happening this week for me as well, if I can. And a lot of my emotions that I'm processing at the moment are about how my soulmate feels about me. Right? And I'm finding them really, really difficult. It's like, the best way I can describe it is, if you can imagine that you can remember being with somebody for 2,000 years, right? And you can feel and remember many of the experiences that you've had together. And then in this life, my worst emotions have been actually to do with separation from my soulmate and from God. That the emotions that occurred in the womb with when I incarnated was so difficult for me that I'm still actually processing through those emotions. And a few months ago, I met my soulmate, and within a few months, only a few weeks ago, she told me many things about that she didn't like about me, and then we didn't feel that we could spend time together. We had to deal with those emotions. But the emotions that I feel from that are huge emotions of rejection. And so a lot of them are based around feelings from that I've at last met my girl, who I've had a longing for all of this life, and I know who she is, but she doesn't want to know me, and she doesn't want to be with me. And also there's many things about me that she doesn't like, mostly physical things. So that is, I'm finding that very, very difficult. There's so many things about me that I can't change that she doesn't like. If it was to do with characteristics of the soul, that I can deal with those at the moment, but the other things I find difficult. And so this week I've been probably crying about 3 or 4 hours every day about that, about these feelings of rejection. But at some stages when I stop crying, what happens is I get into this short space of anger with her. And as soon as I'm in a space of anger, I realise that I'm staying away from the emotion of grief that I need to get back into. And so I always try to get back into that emotion of grief. And it's been quite exhausting because of that, because it's been pretty constant. And so the emotions that I'm working through at the moment are very much related to unworthiness with God and unworthiness with my soulmate, and which also relates to unworthiness with women generally. And so I've attracted in my life many women who have treated me like I'm not good enough for them. You know? When I say many, I've only ever had 3 relationships, but each relationship has been this projection of emotion. So obviously the big emotions that I'm dealing with at the moment is this deep feeling of unworthiness, a deep feeling of sexual unworthiness, and a deep feeling that I'm not attractive or not lovable. Right? So, and in particular, what it's about is that my soulmate doesn't find me attractive or lovable. Right? So it's to do with that relationship. And so all of those emotions are quite deep within me and have been quite deep within me all my life when I look back at my life. And so they are the emotions that I'm dealing with this week. Now, is there any comments you want to make about that? Or questions?
No, just me too.
You too.
That's how I feel.
Yeah.
Just when people don't like you.
Yeah.
And you give them everything that you...
Yeah.
Or you feel...
Do you mind me saying a little bit about your situation, Lisa? Lisa's just going through a breakup of a marriage, and feeling, that's why she's feeling many of the same emotions that I'm feeling, a feeling of rejection and unworthiness and those kind of emotions. But they are all actually related to childhood issues, as you know.
Yeah.
And all of mine are related to incarnation issues. The feeling of separation from my soulmate and that I was to blame for that somehow. And the feeling of separation from God and that I was to blame for that. Because my mother felt she was to blame for everything, and she still does actually feel that she was to blame for everything.
With your soulmate, you said there's 16 years difference from the time you reincarnated.
Yeah.
Why did she reincarnate? Because she didn't have to, did she?
Yeah, really.
She did.
Yeah. There's issues with the joining together of the soul, but obviously we plan for her reincarnation anyway because it's really important that the feminine side of the whole thing that began in the first century is actually dealt with, because in the first century there was a lot of denial of the feminine, and that's caused a lot of problems in history. It's also caused a lot of problems with the Christian religious faiths that have followed as a subsequent result. And there's a lot of things like that we both want to correct. A lot of untruths about women generally, and women in religion and women's relationship to God specifically. So there'll be a lot of things that we start talking about the balance between the masculine and the feminine. And one of the main things that we wanted to do when we made the decision to return was to actually have the soul union occur in a physical state, so that you could see the results of that, and so that you could see the results of what it's like to live in a soul union state while you're on Earth.
So that's your goal, is it?
Yeah, to actually demonstrate 22nd sphere soul union state while we're on Earth, which is what God's intention really was in terms of your future. Yeah.
Is your grief because your soulmate has rejected you, or because you don't know how to deal with the grief?
No, my grief is related to the issues of reincarnation and some events that occurred in the first century. And yesterday people told me to get over it. And regarding our relationship.
No, I'm thinking sometimes people, when they break up, a break away is probably a good life holiday. I mean, you probably have another life anyway, so you meet up again and you're entirely different, you might like it.
No, I don't believe what you believe regarding those things.
No.
Yeah.
I'm not saying I believe that, but I've got an open mind to everything.
Yep.
And I don't believe I disbelieve a lot of stuff. But I take it as it comes.
But that is also at the moment your emotional protection for you.
No.
It wasn't a question.
No, it's not.
You'll find in the future that it is. But that often what we do is we allow ourselves to be open to accepting everything, but in the end we don't accept anything. We don't accept anything into our heart because we're so afraid to make a choice.
I accept things, but I accept things not because whether I believe them or not. If there's somebody else believes them, that's okay. I accept they believe it. I can respect any person's beliefs.
Yep.
They've got the right to believe whatever they feel like.
I'm not talking about that though, I'm talking about this choice that's going on inside of your soul. But I know you don't want to hear what I'm saying, so that's fine.
I don't care what you say.
That's not the emotion coming from me.
Yeah, AJ, this soulmate, how do you know you met your soulmate on a personal viewpoint?
You mean in terms of for anyone meeting their soulmate?
Yeah, you're connected or happen to meet, or for example, you just look at someone. I haven't been down that.
Add in the paper.
Nor a
Add in the paperwork.
I'm Jesus looking for myself.
You should actually do it and see what happens.
In answer to your question, most of us have injuries with the feminine or the masculine or both. The reason why we have those injuries is because when we were children, obviously our parents have injuries with femininity or masculinity or both, and generally with both. And our parents have a combination of, like our father would have certain injuries regarding his mother and his father, and our mother would have certain injuries regarding her mother and her father. And the combination of those two things creates inside of us a list of emotions, if you like, that cause our attractions. So if I'm a male and my mother and father have certain injuries, and I identify in particular with one of those parents, so let's say in my case I identified with my mother's injuries, I then take on many of those injuries towards myself as a male. So my mother's injuries towards her father were that, you know, her father was an abusive drunkard and he abused his wife and some of his children, or all of his children. And my mother's emotions about that obviously are quite strong, in terms of negatively strong about men generally. And then my father also has quite a few emotions about himself as a man that are quite strong, in the sense of unworthiness and feelings like that. Now, when I incarnated into those environments, add that to the feeling that I've just lost my father, my Heavenly Father, and lost my soulmate, and that it's all my fault. And that created within me all these groups of emotions that then created my attractions. And so I was attracted to women who were like my mother, who I could help and look after. And ironically, they couldn't love me, and they were always stressed out by me as a result. Because of course I wasn't being loving. I was actually wanting to be their father, really, in a way. And so obviously that that created so many different. I had so many different injuries about masculinity and femininity within myself. What I had to do before I could actually know who my soulmate was actually work through those injuries, emotionally work through those injuries. So I had to let go, and by letting go, emotionally experience what all of those injuries were about. And that's taken me it took 11 years before I met my soulmate after beginning that process. Because I was not, before that time, ready to even recognise her. So my suggestion, if you want to meet your soulmate, is firstly to focus on dealing with every single emotional injury within yourself relating to masculinity or femininity. Once you deal with those, there's a very high likelihood it'll just come to you who your soulmate is. Now, that being said, there's some people I know overseas who have just basically focused their energy on wanting to deal with their own emotions. And what they've done is they've actually longed to God, they've actually prayed to God to know who their soulmate is, and longed to God that whatever happens, that they can trigger their emotions inside of themselves so they can meet their soulmate. And I know one lady in particular who did this, and within 2 weeks she knew exactly who her soulmate was. Right? And she's not with him. She's married, and she knows who her soulmate was, and her soulmate's not her husband. And her soulmate lives in another country, actually. But now what she's doing is working through her emotional injuries that prevents them from being together. Now, once she does that, he will automatically be attracted into her life. And this is what I found myself, like, as I was working through those injuries, I all of a sudden was feeling like I've got to move to Queensland. I lived in South Australia all my life. But I just felt like I've got to move to Queensland. And initially I was thinking, Airlie Beach or somewhere like that. And I actually, at one stage of my life, had some property developments that was happening up there. And I thought that would be the place I would go. But then one day I just decided, I've got to go to Queensland, and I came to Brisbane, and then I just drove up the coast. And I drove up the coast, checking out different things, going to spiritual churches and a few other things. And I finished up meeting up with this medium. Her name is Hannah. She lives way up at Glenelder, I think it is, which is sort of near Harvey Bay. And so I drove all the way up there, and as I drove through Gympie. And what do I see at signs on the roads are all this Mary stuff. You see that every day, right? Almost, if you drive out that way. The Mary River, of course. Me, though, I'm having these huge emotions driving up there. My Mary's here somewhere. So I just felt that, somewhere around Gympie was Mary, you know. And as it turned out, I met this man as a result of meeting this medium who invited me up to give some talks, where I met people like Helga and Gloria and different ones, and Angela and Gary and different ones that I've met that, you know, now spend a bit of time with. And so he decided he wanted to run a few groups, so I did a few groups there. And guess who came along? Not Mary, her parents. And so I met her parents, and this was a year ago, over a year ago now, 18 months ago. And so, unbeknown to me, my own soulmate's parents I'd just met. And I've even seen photos of her when I visited their home. And they began running some groups in their home, and I occasionally visited their home and did those groups. And I'd see photos of Mary, but it wasn't anything to do with the photo or anything to how she looked or anything like that. She was in Lebanon at the time, living there. And I had a feeling as well that although my soulmate is somewhere around here, she's actually overseas, was the feeling I had. And so what happens after a while is you start, because you're connected with your emotions and your feelings, and you're releasing these injuries about masculinity and femininity, you're starting now to attract your soulmate back to you. Right? Now, at the same time, unbeknown to me, but we've now talked about it, at the same time, Mary, I go through this huge turmoil about November of last year, where I'm feeling like my soulmate's lost to me for good. That was the feeling I was having. And I went, I think some of you knew about that, and I went down to the Sunshine Coast and I just stayed there for a week. And the feeling I had was 3/4 of the way into the week was that, hang on a sec, no, actually everything's going to be all right now. Unbeknown to me, right at that same moment, the same week, she was considering getting married to a man in Lebanon. Right? And I didn't know, and I only found out this recently. And by the end of the week, they'd broken up. A month later, she's back in Australia. And I met her 4 or 5 days, a few weeks after she came back, because her parents ran a group at their place, which I attended. And so I met her for the first time, and I knew instantly who I'd just met. But she didn't know at all, and still doesn't really believe it either, although she has certain emotions associated with it now. So I met her right there and then. Her first emotion towards me was a week later, was one of extreme anger. And it's due to some things coming up from her feelings about the first century and the choices that I made in the first century. So I suppose what I'm saying is, after all of that, is that if you deal with your masculine and feminine emotional injuries, and you then start trusting where your soul is leading you, you will actually find your soulmate. And then, because you've dealt with the masculine and feminine injuries inside of yourself, when you meet her, you will know who she is, or him, you'll know who he is. And as a result of that, you may have lots of emotions to deal with as well, because they may reject you. And you'll need to work through those emotions too, if you still have them. But if you go through that process, you will definitely meet your soulmate here on earth. Pretty much guaranteed.